Welcome back to Count Me In, IMA's podcast about all things affecting the accounting and finance world. I'm your host, Mitch Rochong, and I'm here to kick off episode 107 of our series. The role of the CFO has evolved, and in turn, the skills required of aspiring CFOs have changed too. In this episode, Clive Webb, Senior Insights Manager at ACCA, shares his perspective on what today's CFO is responsible for, what skills are needed, how the pandemic impacted the role, and the best ways to prepare for becoming a CFO. Keep listening as we transition over to the conversation now.
So, Clive, how is the role of the CFO changing?
Well, Adam, I think it's actually quite an interesting question in its own right. I think for a lot of CFOs, the role is broadening. Perhaps you could even say dramatically broadening, and its focus and how it is perceived are changing quite substantially. And what I mean by that is that certainly from the research work that IMA and ACCA did together, we felt that the role of the CFO was either increasing or significantly increasing. And in our survey, about 72% of the respondents felt that the role was broadening out. And I'll talk about that in a second. But actually, quite crucially, and one of the things that was quite strong in the report, we also asked a small selection of CEOs their perception. And if you ask the same question to them, you've got about 82%. So one of the things that we repeatedly saw through the report was, if you like, a demand and supply side difference between the CEOs who really expected the CFOs to go even further than perhaps they thought they were going. And I think that broadening of the role is characterized by a broader set of stakeholders, a broader set of capitals, a broader set of responsibilities that all fall within the CFO's domain.
That makes sense. So, then what do you consider to be included in the role of the CFO?
So I think at the heart of the role remains the traditional financial acumen, financial skill. And as one of the interviewees put it, if the CFO doesn't get that right, then that's the end of that CFO, if you like. So that stewardship, guardianship, asset safeguarding, traditional finance, recording acumen, all those sort of things, risk management, internal control, they are at the heart of the role and very much still at the heart of the role. However, the CFO, I think you can characterize it in two ways now. The first of which is they are the right hand, the conscience of the CEO. So where the CEO particularly is looking more towards sales, towards business growth, towards strategic opportunities, the CFO, yes, is looking towards those, but also is the voice of, dare I say, sanity, the voice of check, the constructive right hand in that process. So not only do you need a view of the financial capital, the liquidity of the organization, which we've seen through the pandemic, it is absolutely vitally important. But if we think broader, it is a role that now embraces strategy. It still has that risk and control side, but that risk and control side itself is changing. Technology and data are playing fundamental parts. A lot of CFOs increasingly talk about scenario modeling and growth optimization as the future. And to do that, you need good technology, and that good technology has to be embedded in data, and that data has to align to the business strategy. They are therefore leaders in the organization. And as we've seen supply chains become increasingly challenged through the pandemic, they need to be on top of that agenda and also the customer-centric agenda as well. And any of these broaden out into a broader sense of what your stakeholders may be, how you think about the different capitals. If you use the Integrated Reporting Council's framework of 6 capitals, a lot of our interviewees thought the CFO increasingly needs to take view and manage stakeholder relationships at senior level across all of those capitals. So your investors are different. You are the ultimate consultant in business sense, and you've got to have a mind to transactions, M&A and growth or divestiture, which the pandemic is going to place an increasing focus on as well. So that's what I mean. It's a very much a broader role.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot broader. And you've briefly mentioned the pandemic, and we're still in this pandemic. And for the foreseeable future, and vaccines and all those things put aside, how has the pandemic impacted the role of the CFO?
I'll go back to a couple of comments, I think, from some of our interviewees. One of them who actually was a CEO, but a former CFO of a finance institution, said, the role of the CFO has been tested by the pandemic, and it's the reliance on the CFO that's going to become more important to give those perspectives, to give that ability to see further. And it's becoming an agile role, as another one put it. There's no place for perfectionism, but there is a place for being able to be agile and to drive the business forwards with a sense of confidence, and therefore understanding the various levers that are pulled. So in those two contexts, I think what we're seeing, and back to my point about the right hand of the CEO, is the CFO increases become a very important role in helping organizations understand what the art of the possible is, what the various scenarios that may play out will lead to, and therefore how basically the organization can survive. And I think the pandemic has reinforced the role of the CFO in very much making that happen.
In the report, there's the 6 hypotheses. And do these 6 hypotheses illustrate the changes happening now for many CFOs?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's probably worth me just explaining quickly for the benefit of those listening that what those hypotheses were. And some of them I've touched on already. The first is that the CFO role broadens out purely from the financial investor and stakeholder management into a broader sense. So keeping that safeguarding reporting, but broadening out what that stakeholder focus actually is. And that the CFO therefore has to have a leading responsibility for business strategy formulation and validation and its execution. And to do that, in the third hypothesis, it becomes around shifting from a cost-centric view to a growth-centric view. And I know at the moment that may seem a challenge, but in reality, I think more organizations increasingly are focusing on the 3 Ps, and that growth becomes a more clear agenda. And to do that, there's a wider view of performance, and this is where those 6 capitals come back in. And it therefore is a role that is looking forward, and that underpins, I think, that scenario modeling that I've talked about. And it becomes a role that is about forward insight, and I think the pandemic has very much reinforced that. And our last hypothesis, and perhaps the most interesting one, became about career progression and whether the CFO was a step towards a CEO role. And the reason I say that's interesting is on a global level, when you looked at the results and we asked survey respondents to give us insight into this, the majority of the early ones were, yes, sort of being achieved or well on the road to being achieved. You come to career progression, you start to see a fairly sharp geographic difference. And in the Asian economies, very much the CFO is the CEO in waiting, and there is a clear step path. In the UK, in Ireland, and some extent in the US, the CFO role is very distinct from the CEO, and some of our round table participants sort of said, well, actually that the CEO is too sales focused, is too dynamic, and I'm a more conservative individual. So you see a difference opening up between career ambitions, between sort of developed and other economies, if I can put it that way.
So we've talked a bit about, how the role is changing and how the pandemic has impacted the roles. So let's shift a little bit, and can we talk about what skills does a CFO need and an inspiring CFO need to develop?
I go back to the sort of 9 areas I outlined a few minutes ago, but I think fundamentally from those, understanding data, understanding technology are absolutely fundamental. And that probably is as fundamental now to successful organizations as that financial acumen and financial stewardship piece is. So if you line that to the strategy, they're becoming increasingly a more operational focus role. And I think that particularly in smaller entities, that is absolutely fundamental. Because the CFO is the super connector, if you like. And being the super connector is a role that requires leadership across the organization, but a role that requires leadership across the communities as well. So it's the ability to tell story, to give the message, to understand the message, to see the future. So there's a very strong interpersonal skill set. There's a very strong, perhaps what I might term quasi consulting skill set. And then you have the financial, the technology, and the risk skill sets. And I think those are the fundamental bits.
You have the fundamental ones. Are there other skills that are needed beyond the traditional skills as the future of the CFO continues to develop in the constantly changing environment?
I think probably we will see this continuous evolution, transformation, and change. And they need to be ultimate change leaders in organizations. And as increasing, I think, and this is probably also from what we gather a result in part of the pandemic, back office functions becoming more centralized, more coalesced, with finance very much at the core of that. It is leadership across that, but it is also how this ever constant change cycle, digital transformation, agility, whatever phrases you want to call it by, that sense of constant change and leadership in a time of constant change and reassuring their teams and bringing their teams with them as part of that change is an absolutely fundamental skill set that now needs to be developed.
So what's the best way to develop these skills?
that itself is an interesting question. And I go back to the sort of the survey results, and only about 25% of the CFOs and other respondents thought enough attention was being paid to developing these skills. But I think a lot of our roundtable participants characterized it in 2 ways. Obviously, that there is the core financial qualification, and that is absolutely fundamental and vital. And I think as this role becomes increasingly growth centric and scenario centric, that financial acumen is fundamental. So the qualification is a bedrock. One of our roundtable participants then added to that statement that actually all an MBA taught them to do was remember what they've forgotten about their accountancy qualification, and they should learn how to reapply it, if you like, which I thought was an interesting comment. I think a lot of it is actually about on-the-job learning, and a lot of our CFOs talked about the need to make sure that they develop the next generation and mentored and coached. And quite a few of them talked about, as their own careers progress, the need to leave behind 1 or 2 viable options in an organization who would be prepared to succeed them. So I think continuous learning, mentoring, the role of peer-to-peer networks, being involved in CFO communities, they're all very, very important grounds to learn the skills. Yes, bits of technology you can learn, micro qualifications in some areas, absolutely important, but it is being coached and developed in that skill set. And rather interestingly, where we asked people where they thought the next CFO was going to start coming from, the most important experience that they need to have in their CV, if you like, is that of a finance business partner. And that traditional path, perhaps, of being from, a senior manager or a director in one of the big four firms, and then swapping over to be a CFO, that path seems to have slightly closed down. And there's more emphasis on in-house experience, but broader experience, such as a finance business partner role, and such as working in the business in other areas, is important. The other context I would add to that is another theme from the report, which talked about the concept of a worldview and the sense that, yes, you need to know your industry, but more importantly, you need to know the world in which your industry exists. So therefore, industry specialization is not necessarily fundamental to developing the skills. What is fundamental is to have a view of where the organizations sit in the greater economic ecosystem, if you like.
Well, Clive, I thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Adam, for giving me the opportunity. And, there's a lot more in the report, so please go and read it.
Yeah, and to our listeners, just check out the show notes. We'll have the link directly to the report that Clive is mentioning.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.